14th is a program called Made in Chicago. And this program is about different items that have been manufactured and made in the Chicago area. And we are hoping to get the speaker in line for July 14th. I haven't heard from him absolutely before this point, but we are planning on that and hoping for it for 6:30 on July 14th. So please look out for that one if you can at all. The thing I also wanted to state is if you have questions at all during the course of the program, by all means, please put them in the chat and we will deal with them at the end of the program. To get started with this, I wanted to talk about Erika's role. She is a curator of decorative arts and history at the Illinois State Museum in Springfield. And this is her third book. She lives in the area, obviously, and this book has to do with Central Illinois, homes that Lincoln had something to do with in Central Illinois. I don't know how many of you have been to the Lincoln home. I myself have been there a total of 3 times. I went there when I was a young child because I lived in the area. My parents took us there. I can remember it was a hot, muggy day. And at the time, the Lincoln home did not have air conditioning. And it was an interesting experience. And that was followed by a visit in 1987 with my husband, who I just married the year before. And he had never been to the Lincoln home. So we took a look at it and took the tour. And it was still pretty much the same, although this time it had air conditioning. When our children were young and we were on our way for a spring break, we stopped in Springfield and did a little day tour of a number of the spots in Springfield. And one of the things that we went to was the Lincoln home. It was a fascinating house and we all thoroughly enjoyed it. But I do have to say, one of the most interesting things that I've ever seen about the Lincoln home was back in 1987. They did an archaeological dig of the whole Lincoln site. It happened over the course of 85, 86, and 87, I think. And in 87, they reported their results to the National Park Service. And one of the most interesting parts of that whole report, as I recall reading in, I think it was a journal on, it was maybe the Journal of the Illinois Historical Society, or it was some type of a journal having to do with Illinois history. One of the most interesting things they talked about were the different privies that were on the site and the archaeological digs that they did with those privies and what they encountered. The whole report was fascinating. And all of it goes back to Abraham Lincoln. And he's such a monumental, iconic figure for Illinois and in Central Illinois in particular. And this is where Erika steps in and gives us a bit of a tidbit of some of the houses that he touched on during his life. Erika, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jane. And I'm so glad you mentioned having visited the Lincoln home, because this book was commissioned by the Looking for Lincoln Heritage Area with the goal of inspiring people to get in their cars and to go check out some of these houses in person. The Looking for Lincoln Heritage Area is a 42 county area. And so all the houses covered in this book fall within that 42 counties. So if you're wondering why there's not, houses in the Chicago area or suburbs, it's because that county is not in this heritage area. But the idea being to get a better sense of Lincoln. It's fun to take a road trip and visit some of the houses that he might have visited or belonged to people he knew. The criteria for inclusion in this book were, first of all, we decided the house had to exist, which seems like kind of a, low bar to cross, but we did have people suggesting to us, oh, there was a really cool house that stood here, you should include that. And we thought like, no, the house should still be standing. And also we wanted it to be open to the public. So this book was published in 2018, which of course is like 500 years ago and like COVID time. But as of the printing of this book, these houses were all open to the public. I can't guarantee what the pandemic has wrought. So if you are inspired to visit any places, I do encourage you to look them up online or give a call ahead just to get a sense of what their hours are if they're open. So the book is divided into 4 sections, and the first one deals with houses associated with Lincoln and his family. And I'm not going to cover every single house in the book, but I do want to give you a sense of what's covered. And Lincoln and his family houses, in Lincoln's time, there would have been many of these because, Lincoln had an extensive connection of in-laws. He had, his stepfamily. There were a lot of Lincoln relations. Most of those houses are gone, and truly of the 4 that you see here, 2 of them are reproductions. They were recreated by the Civilian Conservation Corps. So in essence, only Lincoln's home and the home of his brother and sister-in-law, which is now the Rachel Lindsay Home Historic Site, are still standing. But these are places that either Lincoln or his family actually lived, and so it gives us really wonderful and intimate view into Lincoln. And so my big interest in Lincoln is Lincoln as a person, and I also love historic houses, and I really just think you can get a great sense about someone from visiting the places that they lived and walked. So the first one I want to share with you is the Lincoln Berry Store, and this is at Lincoln's New Salem State Historic Site in Petersburg. And so Lincoln arrived in New Salem when he was 21 years old. He operated a store, or was a store assistant for a while. Then he did a stint in the Illinois State Militia fighting in the Black Hawk War. When the war was over, he landed back in New Salem, didn't have a job, didn't have any place to go, not much going on. And so he kind of fell into storekeeping. He happened to get an opportunity to buy out the store of someone who was moving on and closing up shop. So he went into business with a man named William F. Berry. And they were originally in a different building, and then they bought up more goods from another person who was folding up shop and moved into this building. Well, this is a recreation of the building. And so Lincoln was a storekeeper. He wasn't a very good one. There were parts of storekeeping that Lincoln liked. He liked the socializing part of it. The store was kind of a community hub. Farmers would come in from the surrounding areas to have their wool carted or their grain ground, and they would kind of wander into the store and shoot the breeze until their products were ready. And so Lincoln enjoyed being at the center of everything, hearing all the gossip, being kind of a community leader. He was less good at actually like collecting the money for the store. This is a store that operated on cash and credit. And so when it came time to settle up and for the bills to come due, Lincoln wasn't good at pressing people for money. So this store winked out too, and Lincoln had paid for it all with promissory notes. And when his partner, William F. Berry, died young, Lincoln was on the hook for the entire amount he had sunk into the store. And it was something to the tune of $1,100, which in the 1830s was, I don't even know the exact figure, but let's just say Lincoln called it the national debt because he felt so hampered down by this huge debt that he carried with him. So the town of New Salem didn't survive much past Lincoln's occupancy. He lived there until 1837 when he moved to Springfield. In 1839, the town of Petersburg became the county seat of the county. And so the kind of traffic and everything sort of coalesced in Petersburg, and New Salem became something of a ghost town. So by the time Lincoln died in 1865, there was only one building left in town, and pretty soon that one was gone too. But New Salem's legend and lore lived on. People knew that this had been a formative place in Lincoln's experience. And so there were people who would make pilgrimages in the late Victorian era and have their picnics just to be in a place that Lincoln had walked. And they would sit under trees where they imagined that Lincoln had gone to. So by the time the 20th century rolled around, the state of Illinois acquired the site of Lincoln's New Salem, and during the Great Depression, the Civilian Conservation Corps was hired, and they meticulously recreated all the buildings of this village based on archaeological reports and kind of the reminiscences of people who had lived there and existing maps. So what you have now, if you go to New Salem, is this wonderful recreation of an 1830s Illinois frontier village. And so in the Lincoln Berry store, you'll see the store, the front part of the store is where he conducted business, and the back part of the store is where he slept. And so this is very evocative of Lincoln as this young man just striking out on his own, no real roots or connections, just trying to kind of do these odd jobs or settle on a profession and trying to get by. And it's a really nice contrast with our next site, which is the Lincoln's Home National Historic Site in Springfield. And so it might surprise you to know that when we were talking about this book, there was some intense internal debate about whether we should include Lincoln's home, because some people felt it might just kind of be too obvious, but then we figured you can't have a book about historic houses of Lincoln's, Illinois, and ignore Lincoln's own house. So it went in, which I think was the right decision. And this is a wonderful site. It's operated by the National Park Service. I really encourage you to check it out if you're ever in Springfield. So this is the only home Lincoln ever owned, and it really illustrates his transition in life from this man who was born to farm work. He was kind of this rural farm laborer and laboring man when he was in New Salem. And of course, we know the story of Lincoln, the self-educated man. He taught himself the law, passed the bar, became a lawyer, and now he is like this urban gentleman. And he has married Mary Todd, who is from this very aristocratic family from Kentucky. So Lincoln's basically like living a whole different life in this house, and his house reflects the sort of like middle-class genteel sensibility, which is something that Lincoln's still kind of getting a handle on. And there's like this famous controversy of whether the Lincolns had a happy marriage, and some people think absolutely no, Mary made his life a living hell, and some people think like, you know, they were probably well suited, and you know, they had their ups and downs like any couple. One of their sources of tension was Mary being born to this kind of genteel life, and Lincoln sort of like pulling himself to his bootstraps to be there. And so Mary was sort of at times frustrated with Lincoln's, you know, slowness in grasping the etiquette of their social world, and Lincoln probably dug in his heels sometimes. My personal feeling, and we can talk about this after the talk, is I think they generally got along well and had their ups and downs, and had the misfortune of having their relationship under a microscope, where every single, you know, crossword or fight you have is like written down in history and rehashed over and over again. But love to hear other people's thoughts on that too. So again, inside the home, this is where you really get the best sense of Lincoln as a man, and you get this peek into this genteel home, which is such a stark contrast from the log cabins that he grew up in. We're looking at the formal parlor here that Mary had decorated. This would have been an entertaining space. Across the hall is the family sitting room, which is where the family spent most of their time, where the boys would have kind of rumpused around. People remember Lincoln as being this very hands-on father. They recall coming in the door and seeing him laying on the floor, like dangling a baby above him, or kind of wrestling with his boys. So you get this sense of Lincoln just as a family man, and this is his safe space. Again, totally worth the trip. And we're going to jump ahead. I'm sorry, I thought there was one more slide, but jumping on to the Lincoln Log Cabin State Historic Site in Lerna. This is in Coles County, Illinois. And so this was the final home of Abraham Lincoln's father, Thomas, and his stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnson, who was called Sally, and they're pictured above. So Thomas Lincoln, throughout the course of Lincoln's life, Lincoln was born in Kentucky. He moved with his father to Indiana when he was a small boy. From Indiana, they moved to Illinois in 1830. And Lincoln was 21 years old, so technically he was an adult. He was able to strike out on his own if he wanted to. And he kind of like came with the family to see them settled in Illinois and not be left behind. So the family, they kind of moved around a lot. They settled first just outside Decatur. They finally landed on this estate, which was known as the Goose Nest Prairie area. It was an 80-acre parcel of land. And by that time, Lincoln had moved on. He had gone to New Salem and would from there go to Springfield. So this is Lincoln's father's world, and it's a world that Lincoln was born into, kind of the life of a farmer living off the land. It's a life that Lincoln tried to leave behind by moving to the city and becoming a lawyer, but he couldn't or wouldn't completely shake his ties with his family. So Lincoln and his father had a famously kind of contentious relationship. Thomas Lincoln was said to kind of frown on education, and Lincoln, for his part, Thomas Lincoln deserves some sympathy, because when you think about the 19th century, you have to realize that like your kids are your retirement plan. There's no social security, right? So Thomas Lincoln really needed Lincoln's help on the farm, and kind of the traditional way of things was for kids to stay nearby and care for their parents in their old age. With Lincoln in Springfield, Thomas really didn't have the help he needed on the farm to make it like super prosperous. So they were kind of surviving, but Thomas wasn't like, you know, getting ahead. He never added on to his house or built it into a, you know, added a second story or replaced it with a mansion. He's still living a pretty, you know, like austere lifestyle. Also, by this time, Thomas's eyesight had failed him, and he had been a cabinet maker earlier in his life. But with his eyesight failing, he only had himself and his sort of ne'er-do-well stepson to run the farm for him. So again, they couldn't really get ahead. Lincoln, for his part, didn't cut off his father completely. He would come visit whenever he had legal cases in the area. He would always bring gifts. He would bring them coffee or bolts of cloth, or just give them money outright. He took a special interest in his stepmother and really tried to make sure that she was well provided for. This is what the cabin looked like by the 1880s. Thomas Lincoln died in 1850. His wife, Lincoln's stepmother, lived until 1866, so she did outlive Lincoln himself. The cabin stayed in her children's hands and in their family until 1892, when a group of businessmen came by and said they wanted to take down the cabin and display it at the World's Columbian Exposition the next year. And so the cabin was sold. The businessmen took it apart log by log and carted it to Chicago. Unfortunately, they never got permission from anyone in charge to display it. So the whole display thing didn't happen, and the logs were lost. So again, this is a case where the state acquired the parcel of land in the 1920s, and then in the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps recreated this cabin. So when we look at this cabin, this is the place where Thomas Lincoln spent the last 10 years of his life. He had basically spent his entire span of his life moving from log cabin to log cabin, and that was kind of, you know, the trajectory. Lincoln, this is the life he is born into, and this is the life he leaves behind by becoming a lawyer, and then eventually President of the United States, which took him all the way to the White House. So the second section of the book discusses the homes of Lincoln's friends and colleagues. And for the most part, these are houses that Lincoln visited. There are certainly parcels of land that Lincoln visited, with three exceptions: with the Oglesby Mansion, Davis Mansion, and C.H. Moore Mansion. Those actual houses post-date Lincoln's lifetime. So Lincoln died before the houses were built. We felt that because Lincoln had such strong relationships with the owners, and because each of these houses incorporates Lincoln into their interpretation, that we should include them and people might like to go and visit them. So the next one I'm going to talk about holds a very special place in my heart, because I was the curator of this historic house for 7 years prior to my original gig, or my current gig at the State Museum. And this is historic Edwards Place in Springfield, Illinois. And Edwards Place was the home of Mary Lincoln's sister's husband's brother. So this sounds like 6 degrees of separation when you like string it out like that. But you have to remember, Springfield was a small place before the Civil War, and family connections mattered. So they were considered kind of kin, you know. So this is a place that Lincoln would have visited. He was a fellow attorney of Benjamin Edwards, so they knew each other professionally as well as socially, as well as through their family ties. So this is what the house probably looked like when it was first built in 1833. We know that in 1857, the Edwards family enlarged it to what you see today. That was kind of keeping with the fashion of the times. A lot of the prominent old families were enlarging their houses in the late 1850s, and the Edwardses were super prominent. Benjamin and Ninian were sons of Illinois' territorial governor and third governor, Ninian Edwards. And you might also have heard of their middle brother, Albert Edwards. You might know him by his initials, A.G. Edwards. So this is a family with a lot of money, a lot of social influence, and the house was meant to reflect that. So it's this really wonderful, there we go. It's this really wonderful window into antebellum high society. So when you see these parlors, you kind of have to picture, you know, Lincoln there in his broadcloth suit and Mary there in her silk dress, and everybody kind of entertaining and being on their best behavior. The image I skipped by, after Helen Edwards died at age 90 years old in 1909, the house was given to the Springfield Art Association for use as their headquarters. So the house itself actually became an art gallery, and that's what you're looking at, an image there from the 1920s. But when you visit Edwards Place today, it has been meticulously restored to its 1850s appearance. And I know that for a fact because I was there and I helped to supervise the restoration. There are a lot of wonderful original family pieces, as well as some pieces of furniture with deep connections to Lincoln. The piano you see there actually belonged to Elizabeth Edwards. That's Mary Lincoln's sister. So it's a piano Lincoln would have heard often. We had it restored to playable condition. So every so often, Edwards Place will hold little musical gatherings where you can actually hear the music that Lincoln enjoyed on the actual instrument that he used to listen to it, which is an experience I don't think you can get anywhere else in the world. And also, this is the site of the Lincoln courting couch. And so this is a sofa that also belonged to Ninian and Elizabeth Edwards. And this is the sofa where Lincoln and Mary would sit when he came over to court her. And then it was also there the night that the Lincolns were married. And what you see down below is the handwritten affidavit by Elizabeth Edwards' granddaughter, Mary Edwards Brown, where she says that the sofa was formerly the property of my grandmother. It stood in her drawing room in the days when Abraham Lincoln was calling there to court Miss Mary Todd. It was there, the double parlors, on the night when he was married there to Miss Todd. Moving on to the Oglesby Mansion in Decatur. This is one that Lincoln did not see this exact house. This house was built in 1874. It was built on the site of Oglesby's previous home, which Lincoln probably did see. But Richard Oglesby is this really great character. He's kind of become a footnote in Illinois history, but he's a really fascinating guy. He and Lincoln met in 1840 when Oglesby was a 16-year-old listening to Lincoln give a stump speech. Little did he know that about a decade or two later, they'd be good friends. By 1858, they had been drawn together through their mutual interest in politics, first as Whigs and then Republicans, and then also because they were both lawyers, they knew each other from the law. And so by 1858, Richard Oglesby was one of the people who had the honor of sharing the stage with Lincoln during one of his campaign speeches for the Senate. By 1860, Oglesby is one of the original Lincoln men who is telling Lincoln he should run for president. And Oglesby is the person who, at the Illinois Republican Convention in Decatur in 1860, arranges for Lincoln's cousin John Hanks to come into the arena carrying a rail that Lincoln had split 30 years ago. And there was a banner attached to it that said, Abraham Lincoln, the rail candidate. So if you hear of Lincoln, the rail splitter, it's basically the marketing ploy concocted by Richard Oglesby. So Oglesby went on to serve eventually as a major general during the Civil War, and then he was elected governor of Illinois in 1864. So he was in office and was able to ensure that Illinois was the first state in the Union to pass the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. Oglesby went on to serve another term as Illinois. He served in the U.S. Senate and then finally a third term as governor. So his first wife had died in the 1870s, and he remarried a beautiful young widow named Emma Keyes Gillette. And so this house was built to kind of as a present to his new bride and to accommodate their new and growing family. So they brought in a Chicago architect and created this house, which was completed by 1874. And it was, finished in the grandest style with all the wallpaper and mahogany furnishings. And when you go to it now, especially the library, is like stepping back in time. It's almost exactly as it was in the Oglesby's day. The entire mansion is filled with personal possessions, clothing of the Oglesbys. So it's really this wonderful time capsule of his life. And I think it's interesting connected to the Lincoln story because it makes me think of what Lincoln's life would have been like had he lived. Lincoln was only 56 when he was assassinated. He could have gone back to work as an attorney. He could have lived off his paychecks as president. He might well have built himself a fancier house like many of his contemporaries were doing. So this is sort of like what could have been for Lincoln had he lived out the course of his natural lifespan. Another house that flies way under the radar is the John Shasted House. This is in Pittsfield in Pike County. And one of the most fun things about writing this book was that I got to learn about all these wonderful sites. And I live in Central Illinois now. I consider myself a history buff and a historic house buff. And I hadn't heard of half of these houses before I wrote the book. But they were all really wonderful to see, wonderful to visit the communities and explore each community's tie with Lincoln. So John Shasted was a friend of Lincoln dating back to his New Salem days. Eventually Lincoln moved to Springfield and Shasted moved to Pittsfield. They kept in contact, and whenever court business brought Lincoln to Pittsfield, he would look in on the Shasteds and see how they were doing and spend some time with them. And there's one lovely story that comes down to us from the Shasted children and their descendants. And it deals with Lincoln being in town for court, and he let himself in the front door because they were that good of friends. And he let himself into this parlor and found that the family was assembled and about to sit down to a dinner of broiled quail, which they called pigeons in those days. So all the kids had, been smelling it cook all day and were ready to eat. And Lincoln was given the seat at the head of the table as the guest of honor. And the plate of broiled pigeons were put in front of him, and Lincoln started putting them into his mouth one by one, taking them, and all the kids being, encouraged to be on their best behavior, just sat, and they were told, no, don't help yourself until the guest has had his fill. And one kid said that they watched the pigeons disappear into the vast Lincolnian reservoir until finally Lincoln took the very last one and ate it. And one of the little kids said, "Abe Lincoln, you're an old hog." And so Lincoln was very sorry that he had eaten the kids' dinner. And then later on, Thomas Shasted, the little boy who called him an old hog, was kind of a big supporter and admirer of Lincoln. He said he thought he was a very fine orator, a fine lawyer. And his father, John, was an old man by the time that Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. And it said that the news was kind of coming around town off the telegraph wires. And one person was saying that, "Oh, Lincoln's dead. I'm glad he's dead." And Shasted said, "Wait, who did you say dead?" And the man said, "Oh, Abraham Lincoln's dead, and I'm glad of it." And Shasted, who was an old man but still, fiery, just punched him right in the face and laid him out right there on the ground. So this house stayed in the Shasted family until the 1920s. It had two subsequent owners, and then in 1989 was donated to the Pittsfield Historical Society, who operates it now and has restored it to its about 1860 appearance. Another what might have been was the David Davis Mansion in Bloomington. This is a mansion that was constructed in 1872, so again, Lincoln never saw it. Lincoln would have visited this site though, because the Davises built their new mansion on the site of their original Frame I house, and this is a place that Lincoln actually would have visited during life. What's still standing in the back is the house's original barn that dates to the 1850s, which is where Lincoln would have stabled his horse when he came to visit. So David Davis was sort of Lincoln's opposite in many ways. Davis was from a wealthy family. He was well educated. He was kind of rotund, where Lincoln was thinner and from a more humble background, but the two got along really well. They were both attorneys on the 8th Judicial Circuit, and then David Davis was eventually elected circuit court judge. And so they would travel the circuit together for 2 times, 10 to 12 weeks a year. So they got to know each other very well. In 1860, Davis was one of the people who managed Lincoln's presidential campaign. Lincoln eventually rewarded Davis with a position on the Supreme Court in 1862. When Lincoln was assassinated, the first telegram that Robert Lincoln placed was to David Davis that said, "Come here immediately, we need your help." So this house is just magnificent, and what's so wonderful about it is that it stayed in the Davis family until 1959. And so almost all the furnishings are original, all those books in the library are original, and what's more, they actually like have the receipts to show, you know, where they bought things and when. When David Davis, I believe the 5th, died, the state of Illinois acquired this house. And interestingly enough, they wanted Davis's papers because Davis had this tremendous trove of family papers, including about 20 documents written in Abraham Lincoln's hand. So the state basically agreed to take on this house so they could get their hands on the papers. So now the papers are open to public research, and the house has been restored and is open to public view. The Fithian home in Danville is another one that I hadn't heard of till I started writing this book. Dr. Fithian was another Whig colleague of Lincoln's. They were both sworn into the Illinois House of Representatives on the same day in 1834. Fithian went on to serve another term in the House and in the Senate, but kind of basically peeled off to concentrate on his medical practice, and also he speculated in land on the side, which a lot of Lincoln's professional colleagues did. Again, he's someone that Lincoln kept in touch with, so whenever legal business took Lincoln to Danville, which was part of his legal circuit, even though it's all the way on the eastern part of the state, Lincoln would come and spend time with the Fithians. This is what the house looked like when Lincoln came to visit. And actually the bedroom that he stayed in is one of the ones that has a little iron balcony off to the side. So the most memorable visit happened on September 21st, 1858, because that is when Lincoln was in the middle of campaigning for the US Senate. And there was this huge Republican rally in Danville. So Lincoln attended this rally, and then the crowd kind of escorted him back to Fithian's house where he was spending the night. And so Lincoln came in, got settled in, took off his boots and made himself comfortable, but the crowd was still outside and they were calling for a speech and calling for a speech. And so Lincoln obliged them. So he stepped out onto that little balcony and addressed them some, you know, brief, appropriate remarks. And it said that he gave that little speech in his stocking feet because he had already pulled off his boots and his feet were too swollen to put them back on. So today the house has been restored. It's not restored entirely to 1858. Different rooms are kind of restored to different time periods to reflect different members of the family. Like the downstairs parlor is like Dr. Fithian's medical office and has a lot of family artifacts. But the bedroom that Lincoln stayed in has been restored to its original 1850s appearance. And that is actually the Fithian's original bed that was there when Lincoln stayed there. And so this property is owned by the Vermilion County Museum, which has a display in the museum building proper of a desk setup that belonged to Ward Hill Layman, which was a Danville attorney, and Lincoln would partner with him when he came to town on legal business. So there's a bonus little Lincoln display in Danville to see. And so the third section of the book focuses on Lincoln's times and legacy. And so these are places that Lincoln, except for with one exception, did not visit that we know of. He might have, that went unrecorded, but these are houses that kind of give a window into Lincoln's world. And so they're included just to kind of flesh out the broader story of Lincoln's life and times. for instance, the Joseph Smith Mansion House in Nauvoo. It would be a super cool story if we knew that Lincoln visited Joseph Smith at his house. Unfortunately, we don't think he did, but it's still a wonderful site that's worth visiting. So the first one to interpret is one that we are fairly sure Lincoln actually visited, and that's the Bryant Cottage State Historic Site in Bement, Illinois. So this is a house where, according to the family descendants, the course of history was changed because this is the house where Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas met to plot out their joint debates in 1858. So in 1858, when Lincoln and Douglas were running against each other for the Senate, Douglas was the political superstar. He had already been well established on the national stage. He had the name recognition. Lincoln was basically a guy who had been in Congress 10 years ago and kind of, people knew him locally, but he really didn't have a national presence. And so for the first part of the campaign season, Douglas would be making speeches and Lincoln was kind of trailing in his wake, and he would use the opportunity to take advantage of the crowds Douglas gathered to give a rebuttal and kind of get his ideas out there. By mid-July, Lincoln writes to Douglas and says, hey, why don't we have some debates? And Douglas writes back immediately and says, I don't want you sharing the stage with me when I've already lined up speaking engagements, but how about we set up a series of joint debates, one in each of Illinois' congressional districts? And Lincoln wrote back to that and said, yes, that sounds great. And rather than stick it in the mail, Lincoln hopped on a train and went to Monticello, Illinois, where he wanted to intercept Douglas, where Douglas was giving a speech. And they happened to meet on the road 2 miles outside of Monticello. And Douglas basically said, I don't want to talk about this in the road. Come back to Bement, where I'm staying, and come to the Bryant's house, and we'll work it out there. So Lincoln did, and they sat in the parlor and kind of hashed out their idea for these 7 joint debates. By the next day, Stephen Douglas sat down to write out a letter, kind of, putting into formalizing what they had discussed, which is the letter that you're looking at there. The date line is still in Bement, so Douglas probably sat in that parlor and composed this letter. And so, of course, the Lincoln-Douglas debates launched Lincoln's kind of national ascendancy. He didn't actually win the debates. Well, he didn't win the Senate seat. It's debatable which debates he actually won or didn't. But Douglas was the one who was elected to the Senate, but Lincoln had catapulted himself onto the national stage. So 2 years later, when it was time to run for president, Lincoln, had the stature and was eventually, of course, as we know it, elected to the presidency. So today this cottage is owned by the state of Illinois. It's been restored to its 1850s appearance. So you can go in and really get a sense of, Lincoln and Douglas sitting there and having their fateful meeting. Another house that kind of flies under the radar, but is well worth a visit, is the Richard Eels house in Quincy. And this was built in 1836 for a doctor named Richard Eels, who had come from Connecticut and had very strong abolitionist sentiments. He was actually the president of the State Abolitionist Society in the 1830s. And he was a man who helped hundreds of formerly enslaved individuals find freedom on the Underground Railroad. So one night in 1842, Eels heard a knock at the door. It's displayed inside the house now, but at the time it was an exterior door. And he opened the door to find an escaped enslaved man named Charlie, who had just run away from his farm in Missouri and swum across the Mississippi River and come to Eels's house because he knew it was a safe place. Eels knew that he was kind of already on the radar of slave catchers and pro-slavery types, and so he felt that Charlie would be safer at the Quincy mission house. So he put Charlie in the carriage and attempted to drive him there. The slave catchers were indeed onto them and after them. Charlie tried to escape on foot, but was captured and returned to Missouri. Eels was arrested and charged with aiding and abetting a runaway, which was a crime in Illinois. Illinois, although a free state that did not permit slavery within its borders, also wasn't doing a whole lot to help escaped enslaved people. And so those who were thought to be abetting slaves, like Eels, were charged with a crime. Eels was brought before the court the next April, found guilty, and fined $400. The following year, he appealed all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court, where the ruling was upheld. So Eels personally died in 1846, but a group of abolitionists appealed his case on his behalf all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1852. And two of the attorneys on that case were Salmon Chase and William Seward, who would one day wind up in Lincoln's cabinet. Again, the ruling is upheld, and it wasn't until 2014 when Illinois Governor Pat Quinn posthumously pardoned Richard Eels for helping an escaped enslaved person. So the house has this display that really gives insight into the culture of abolitionism, anti-slavery thought, the different kind of modes of thought that people had regarding slavery during antebellum Illinois. And the house has also been restored in this one, oops, and I didn't show a picture. There's a lot of family artifacts. There's a lot of these clever little windows in the wall where you actually get a sense for the architecture of the home. The John Wood Mansion is also in Quincy. This house is great because this house actually is directly tied to John Wood's political fortunes. He had come to Quincy in 1822, and by 1836 he was prosperous. He wanted to build himself the grand house that you see here. So he went to St. Louis and recorded German craftsmen to come up and build his house, not finding the level of skill that he wanted in the Quincy area. So he imported these German craftsmen to the Quincy area and paid them either in free land that he had amassed or deeply discounted land. So he kind of helped to seed this German American community in Quincy. Wood himself spoke fluent German. And so because of these ties to the German community, he was added to the ticket in 1856 to kind of balance out and appeal to the German American community in Illinois. So Wood was lieutenant governor in March of 1860 when the sitting governor, William Bissell, died of pneumonia, which immediately made him governor. Now, Wood had his own life and business and really wasn't expecting to become governor, so he was reluctant to pick himself up and move himself to Springfield. He was in the middle of things here in Quincy. So he asked for and obtained permission to do his official executive business out of this office, which he fitted up for the purpose. And because he was the governor and living and working out of this home for that time in 1860 into 1861, this actually was considered an Illinois executive mansion. So Wood is out here in Quincy doing his official business. Meanwhile, back in Springfield, Abraham Lincoln has accepted the nomination to the presidency and needs a campaign headquarters. So Wood says, you know, I'm not using the governor's office in the State House. Why don't you use it? So Lincoln sets up camp here. He's in Wood's office because Wood is back in Quincy and Lincoln is meeting with all kinds of people every day who want to get a look at this guy who's running for president and shake his hand and see what he's all about. And then finally, the last house I'm going to talk to you about tonight is the Troba Good House in Decatur. This is owned by the Macon County Conservation District. And I think this is such an important house because it's so typical of the time and so typical that very few houses of its kind survive. Historic houses tend to be mansions. They tend to belong to, you know, important men of the day. And so they sort of give us a skewed perspective of the past and leave us thinking that everyone lived in these elaborate mansions. When the actual case is that this is sort of your everyday house owned and lived in by an everyday family who weren't noteworthy enough to, you know, be written about in history books. Indeed, we know very little about the Troba Good House. We know that John Troba moved to Illinois in the 1850s. He came from Tennessee. He was one of thousands and thousands of people who came to take advantage of the cheap land for sale by the government, which could be bought for $1.50 an acre. And so that land, that moving westward and buying land, that was kind of how people got ahead in the 19th century. It was sort of the equivalent of like the 90s .com boom, like this is how you invest in yourself. This is either how you get into the middle class or secure your place in the middle class. So Troba really is sort of like an everyman for Illinois. He started with this one-room log cabin. He eventually enlarged it. By 1860, it was 2 rooms. He had covered it with frame. He was living there with his wife, his mother-in-law, his 2 children, and 3 farmhands. And so this is the life also that Lincoln was born into. This is, again, a path not taken. If one of those grand mansions is a path not taken for Illinois, this is the path not taken. Had he stayed with his father, had he stayed with farming as a profession, Lincoln would have been another John Troba. This is also a peek into the world of the type of men that populated Lincoln's life. These were the people that Lincoln was speaking to when he gave a political speech. These were the type of people who were his clients in court. Probably 75% of Lincoln's clients were farmers who were settling estates or settling land disputes. So it was men like these who, were really Lincoln's bread and butter. And they were people who would come to see Lincoln in court. Lincoln would go to Macon County on his judicial circuit, and court day was kind of like an event. It was like I don't know, like a market day or a farmer's market. It's when the lawyers are in town, so you come to town and you conduct your business and you buy your things and you stay and listen to a court case just for kind of entertainment's sake, something to do and meet up with people. So it's very possible that Troba could have been in the courtroom listening to Lincoln argue a case. But it's this very ordinariness and giving just such an accurate picture of the types of houses that would have been ubiquitous on Lincoln's landscape that I think makes this such a gem. So again, it's owned by the Macon County Conservation District. If you go inside, it's been restored to its 1860s appearance. So you can see just kind of what Lincoln's world was like. And even though Lincoln didn't visit it himself, he would have known it. It would have been very familiar to him. And I'll just leave that up because it seems like I've come to the edge of my presentation, but now I'd be happy to take questions, or I'd be happy to discuss anything of interest.
Thank you so much, Erika. I sure appreciate it. My apologies to all of the people who got in a little bit late to the program. That is my mistake. I do apologize for it. If you have any questions for Erika, if you would be so kind as to leave them in the chat box, that would be great. We will address them now. And I guess my first question, in looking at the photos of the Edwards house and the courting couch, is that what it was called again? The courting couch?
Right, yeah.
Is it really as short as it looks, and how positively uncomfortable had that been for Abraham Lincoln to sit there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually not as short as it looks. It's pretty wide substantially, but it is made or upholstered with horsehair, which is a common fabric in the day. It's not very giving. It's not a sofa that you're going to curl up on and fall asleep. And there was just a different idea of, especially parlor furniture in the 19th century. Your parlor was almost more of a stage setting than a place to relax. It was the place where you did all your ceremonies. People got married out of the parlor and had funerals out of the parlor and did their formal visiting. So, you were upright on display, on your best behavior, showing your best etiquette. A typical social call was meant to only be about 15 minutes. You were supposed to come in, pay your dues or respects, and then sort of move along. So you're right, it definitely wasn't designed for people to settle in and get comfortable all evening.
One of the other questions that we have is, what is the name of the book again, and do you know where it is available in this area?
It is called Historic Houses of Lincoln's, Illinois. I don't know how it's being carried or if it's carried in stores. I do know it's still available on Amazon, though.
I did see that today. Very good. Does anybody else have a question? My other question was, I know I couldn't help but notice the home, the Carl Sandberg home in Galesburg.
Yes.
That popped up on the last screen. That's where I had my first job, and it is to my everlasting regret that we did not go there when we lived in Galesburg. Not that we can't go back again, but it is on a little bit further away from us than when I was right in town. What connection does that have to Lincoln?
So that one, again, was a little bit of a stretch, but we did think, first of all, Sandberg grew up in an area that was steeped in Lincoln's legacy. So even though he was born after Lincoln died, he grew up in the shadow of people who had been to the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Galesburg. Like, Lincoln's presence was very much alive in the area, and that seeped into Sandberg so much that he ended up writing what became a 6-volume biography of Lincoln that won the Pulitzer Prize. So we stretched that just a little bit and tied that to Lincoln's legacy, you know, because the inspiration of growing up in Lincoln's shadow, you know, from humble circumstances inspired Sandberg to eventually, you know, perpetuate Lincoln's legacy through his book.
We do actually have all 6 volumes at our library in the Illinois collection. So I would say that they will always be there because they are such a well-known set of history, I think. So that's good to hear. If no one else has any questions, and it appears no one does at this point in time, I guess we're ready to, oh, somebody just asked, where did Lincoln stay when he had business in Chicago?
That is a good question, and I don't know if I can pinpoint an exact address. He probably would have stayed in a hotel. Sometimes he was known to stay with friends as well, but I don't know his Chicago activities well enough. So my guess is probably in a hotel, and Chicago, you know, was growing as an urban center by the 1850s. So they did have, you know, these big multi-room kind of elaborate places.
Okay. Thank you. This has been very enjoyable. One of our attendees said good job and he enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Erika. If you have any questions for me to relay to her later on, by all means, I will put my email in the chat box, and you are more than welcome to contact me and I'll pass it on to her. Thanks so much, Erika.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.